Okay, guys, good morning. How's it going? Yeah, I had to do the thumbnail from just outside the classroom because the classroom was locked at first, so I had to wait for the campus safety to come and unlock the room. That's why you see the weird kind of film noir thumbnail for this particular meeting, but not to worry. So welcome back. Hi, Ryan, good to see you. Hey, Elif. Just about 2.5 minutes. Hi, Elise. Welcome back. Kylie, good morning. Hey, Amanda. Connor, good morning to you. Nina, welcome back. Hey, Stephen, Jianyan. Good to see everyone. Hope you had a good weekend. Dimitri, Grant, yes, welcome back. Hey, Nicole. Oh, what? Claire said she's at the door outside the lecture hall? It shouldn't be locked. This can't be locked. No, she's not here. I know that as a fact because I just had the campus safety come and unlock the room. Ryan, tell me something. Ask Claire what room is she outside of? Because the room's unlocked. This is Argyrio's Forum, room 208, so I don't know how that could possibly be. But that's awesome to learn this right as class is starting. Now we got to troubleshoot. I want to make sure she doesn't get lost. So can we rectify this? Claire, 208 of what building? Are you on another opposite wing? I think I hear a knock. Is that you? Because there's 2 doors perhaps. I don't know. Let me look at the other side. I would come through the other door.
Gotcha. That was on the out sticker.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I would have my mask on. I was looking around for you over there. Okay.
I'm fully vaccinated.
Okay, yeah, same here, but okay. Anyway, then, thank you guys. I found Claire. Basically, there's 2 different entrances, which I didn't really know of. I always come in through the side door in the hall, and that's the one that I had the officers unlock. But anyway, thank you guys for being here, and hope you had a great weekend. Let me just start off with a quick question. to sort of set the table here. Did you guys notice my message with the essay prompts from, what was that, Friday? Let me just know that you got it. Hi, Sloan. Okay, Ryan, good. Dimitri, thanks for that confirmation. So basically, that's the second set of essay prompts. You would just choose one of the three to work on. And with a few minutes here at the beginning, let me just kind of go over that, the quick document that we have. So I'm looking at it now on my screen. Basically, the directions say that you have to write a 3 to 4 page essay, double spaced in 12-point font with normal margins on exactly one of these three prompts below. You're not allowed to use any internet resources or assistance. And it's due on Friday, May the 7th. So I made a little adjustment to the due date. Originally in the syllabus, it was listed as Monday the 3rd. So I simply pushed it out 4 days ahead. And it's overall worth 25% of your grade. It's similar in formatting then to the first essay, the same kind of length requirement and formatting requirements. So you'd pretty much just do the same kind of overall format stuff, but then you have these three topics to choose from. The first topic has to do with material that we'll start speaking about today, monism and dualism, philosophy of mind. And so if you want to work on that topic, I would say probably delay the beginning of your draft and maybe until the end of this week so that you have some content from the lessons and from the book to work with. But anyway, the first topic has to do with philosophy of mind. What it says is, and again, these are concepts that will make more sense after the series of lectures this week. But what it says is explain the concept of dualism and monism, and then explain the concept of supervenience physicalism. You can refer to the works of Descartes, Stoljar, Smart, and Turing. So those are going to be the four authors for us in this unit of the class. Finally, you'll state your own view of which thesis you prefer and why. So we'll get into this and we'll start it today, but you'll learn about what these different views are, what is dualism, what is monism in the philosophy of mind, and what is supervenience physicalism. And if you choose to write on this topic, then you'll have a set of authors there that discuss those topics, and you'll evaluate them and then give your view about which one was better at the end. The second topic has to do with time, which we just kind of wrapped up. What it says is explain the way that Einstein changed the understanding of time with his theory of relativity using our assigned readings, class lectures, and video presentations. There is one video that I was going to send you guys. I think I'll send that tonight so you can use it if you want to as a resource for that, if you choose to write on this paper. The thing is, it's a YouTube video that I downloaded or paid for, which was originally broadcast as like a science special on the from Nova about the theory of relativity. It's very good and well narrated, and it helps to shed light on some of the lessons. So in keeping with what I wrote here in the text of the prompt, I'll forward that to you guys. If there's a paywall for it, I don't know. I'll try to eliminate that, but if there is, it's just your option to watch it or not, but I think it's like $2. Anyway, using those readings, lectures, and video presentations, explain the idea of the relativity of simultaneity, the three ways that time is like space according to Ted Sider, and the way that space-time theory eliminates the idea that time, quote-unquote, moves. Finally, state whether you prefer Einstein's concept of time or the classical Newtonian view that existed before him and why. So that's another option for you. And then the third prompt has to do with the theory of knowledge, epistemology, and the work of the classic Greeks and Edmund Gettier. It says, explain the classical idea that knowledge can be defined by three separately necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. So those are justification, truth, and belief. You'd explain in that case why they're each needed and why they're not enough unless you have all of them. So you may have to, in that situation, give examples of cases where a person satisfies some but not all of the conditions, and then demonstrate through reason why intuitively that's not an example of having knowledge. Then you would explain how Gettier showed that the classical definition was insufficient. In that first part, you could also talk a little bit about the Greek dialogue of the Meno, and you could say why Plato and Socrates thought that justification transformed something that was just a correct opinion into an item of knowledge, and the metaphor of the statues and stuff. But then you'd explain how Gettier showed that the classical definition was insufficient. So you'd walk us through his preliminary points, the closure principle, and then the description of at least one of his cases, probably Smith and Jones' job hunt. And then you'd show why in that example someone is claimed as having a justified true belief that is not knowledge, which would mean that the definition is not sufficient to define the concept. Then you would discuss whether you prefer the classical account, JTB, or you thought that Gettier's criticism of it means that it's not correct, and why. Stephen, the classical idea of knowledge is Plato's, and do we have to use both of Getier's examples? You don't have to refer to both of them, Stephen, but you may if you wish. At a minimum, of course, you do have to talk about probably the first Gettier case, but there's all kinds of other additional Gettier examples that you can add to the discussion once you've given a full and detailed analysis and breakdown of the classic case one. So you may use more than one, but for sure, touch on the first one at a minimum. Okay, and so those are 3 different topics. You have plenty of time to work on them. Starting today, you still have 2 weeks and 4 days, so that's like 18 days away. And if anybody's working on a draft and they're getting close to finishing it and they have time to share it, I'd be happy to look at it, but that's up to you. As long as it was to come to me not too late before the deadline itself, then I could probably return back some comments at a minimum for those that want to. So that's 3 different topics. It's your second paper. I would advise that you don't write it at the very last minute, but that you should integrate some quotes from the book. And just write on the one that you find the most interesting or that you think you can have most success with, but don't write on more than one, obviously. Just choose your favorite, and then that'll be it. So if that's good for now, I guess I'll just keep rolling into the lectures and into our new topic today. But feel free anytime to ask me questions through email, if you come to class in person, or at office hours that I hold each Friday. And we should be all good to go with that. Afterwards, the last thing, of course, is going to be the final exam, and I'll distribute the study guide questions for that in advance of the 14th week so that we can hold those review sessions and talk about the study guide. So are we all good on this? Let me know if you can in the chat, and if so, that's great. Cool. All right, so I think that's well understood. Again, let me know later if there's something that comes up as you're developing your topics or your draft. All right, then. So today we have another key meeting because we're going to transition to another topic in philosophy. And looking back at what we've studied to this point, we've covered a lot of interesting ground. We looked at philosophy of religion, ethics, epistemology, and just now the metaphysics of time. What's left? Well, there's much left, but we can't cover it all. We have a few things, though, in our class that we're still going to talk about. So one thing that we'll now start with is the philosophy of mind, another major important topic in philosophy. Philosophy of mind. Make sure that I got the angle here the right way. Yeah, so the philosophy of mind, what is that? This is the part of philosophy that is interested in questions concerning consciousness, perception, and thought. So it's sort of the study of consciousness. Okay, so consciousness, I'm sure you guys have at least general sense of the concept. It's being aware, being able to perceive, having a subjective viewpoint on reality. The marker here in my hand has no consciousness. It's not got a central nervous system, a brain, or any of the sense perception organs that you would need to have any kind of point of view or observation on the surrounding world. So it's just a thing, it's just an object. But me and you are subjects. We see things, we perceive. We can just, sit back and think of thoughts in our mind. You could be listening to this lecture, or you could be just with your device on thinking about other things. But in your head, you've got thoughts, you've got mental activity. You can go back in your memories, you can dream of the future. You can, so obviously the internal life of the mind, the thinker, the thoughts that you have. What is that all about? What's the understanding that we can have about it philosophically? There is a series of interesting questions that get pursued within this field of philosophy. So let me write some of the big core questions that animate the philosophy of mind. So as I define the topic for you, just understand that it does have to do about the realm of the thought and consciousness. What's the basic understanding or essence of that? Questions like this come to the surface. For example, so here's some of the main questions. We've got the question, are the mind and the brain the same thing, or are they two different things? Okay, so we all know that we have a brain, and scientifically, studies in neuroscience and cognitive psychology show us that the brain is the seat of consciousness. That's where cognitive activity takes place. And some people believe that that's the whole entire basis of consciousness. So for you to think or feel or have perception is because of the brain, and it is the brain. Some people think that the mind and the brain are the same thing. But other people think that there's a difference there. Some people will say that the mind, the thinker, the consciousness that you have is something maybe more spiritual than just the brain, right? The brain is a physical object, which can, of course, can and will be destroyed, dust to dust and all of that. Does that mean that if there's no brain, there's no possibility for a consciousness to exist or to survive? So some people think the mind is a separate question or a separate thing from the brain, that they're somehow related, but that the mind can endure and survive even in a disembodied state. So there's this question whether consciousness is primarily physical or whether there's a non-physical basis for it. That kind of same pattern of thought leads to further questions along the same lines. Can consciousness be explained physically? Yes or no? Some people question this. Can consciousness be explained on a totally physical basis? Some people think yes, people that are scientific realists and kind of more secular folk are going to say that the brain is the basic source of consciousness, and studying the brain is to study consciousness. So it's ultimately a physical phenomena governed by the laws of our neurochemistry and our biology. But some people say no, there's something about consciousness that's too rich, too special, to be reducible to the operations of neurons and synapses in your brain. So they think there's more than just the electrochemical source of the brain for consciousness, like the idea of a soul, spirit, a disembodied, immaterial basis for consciousness. So we'll study the question and the debate on both sides of this question too. Another one, could a machine ever think, or is that not possible? Could a machine ever have consciousness? Like, a robot, a computer, an AI system. Is that even possible or no? Some people say yes, including, and we'll study this as well, the creator of the computer, that's Alan Turing, the inventor of the digital computer, way back in 1950, said that he believed it was a possible outcome in the future, that inevitably, as computers began to become more powerful with better processing power and storage capacity, that eventually we will see thinking machines, like you've seen in the realm of science fiction, where cyborgs and robots and stuff live among us and are conscious as well. But other people say no, that's not even theoretically possible. Some people will argue that even if a machine was able to imitate human behavior down to the last detail, that there's not actually any real cognitive activity inside, like it's not having any feelings or thoughts. It's just kind of an input-output system, like a video game system or something that's not actually perceiving or experiencing anything. But that's another debated question that we'll also talk about. So we'll kind of review these big issues in the philosophy of mind. And to kind of give us a structure for how to approach the debate, let me tell you about two big positions in the philosophy of mind. Yeah, these are two big positions that kind of are the rival schools of thinking around questions like these. So we need to know about that. I'll erase the info here and create some space. Okay. Yeah, so two main positions in the philosophy of mind. Okay, so there's monism, and then you've got dualism. Okay, monism and dualism. First of all, the monist position. So what monism says is that everything in the universe, all things, from no matter how different they are on the surface, all things are made out of one kind of substance, only one kind of substance. Okay, so everything in the universe
is made out of one kind of substance. Monism. So etymologically, the word monism has the root mono, meaning one, like monotheistic, believing in one God. Mono speakers is just one audio channel instead of two. Monogamy, having one partner. So anyway, you get the idea. Monism, one. One kind of substance makes everything in reality. Now, given this position that everything is made out of one type of substance, there's two different varieties of monism. So there's like monism version 1 and 2. So let me talk to you about the two different branches of monism before we swing over to dualism. I'll get to that in a minute. But two types of monism. So one, the difference between the two is based on what type of substance that the person thinks that everything's made out of. So one possible brand of monism is what's called physicalism. And then the other one is called idealism. Now, physicalist monism is the one we're going to focus mostly on in this class. So this is more important, really, than the other, but we're going to know about both. So physicalism says that the only substance, the one substance that makes everything up in the universe, is physical matter. So the view is that everything in the universe is made out of physical matter, including us and our consciousness. So everything, even the world of thought and perception and your mental life, is just made out of physical matter according to this position. So everything in the universe is made out of physical matter. Everything's made out of physical matter, including, and this is key, including us and our consciousness. So we're no exception to this on the physicalist perspective. Okay, so everything in the universe is made out of matter according to physicalism. That's one branch of monism, the monism that holds that all this stuff around you is just made out of matter. Now, what is the most fundamental unit of matter? Well, first of all, I guess let me give you a more base description of the concept of physical matter as it's understood in this philosophical school of thought. So over here to the side, I'm going to write out a definition. Oh, sorry. You guys on camera couldn't see that. I just tripped over the charging cable, but no problem. Okay, so physical matter definition. So physical matter is something that is extended in space. So is extended in space, and the most minute element of it, what do you guys know about physics? If I asked you what is the most basic component of physical matter, what's the basic term that is often used for that? Anybody have a sense? Let me know. You break matter down and down and down until you get to this little thing. And it seems like, at least in our language, we usually use this as the word for the smallest bit of matter. Thoughts, memories, information that you know about this? Little particles, what do they call them? Atoms, there you go, Ryan, correct. So physical matter is just anything that is extended in space. And at the most fundamental level of physical matter, we have atoms. Okay, so according to physicalism, that type of monism, everything in this whole universe, you look around you, the surroundings around you, plus even you yourself, it's just all made out of matter. And ultimately what matter is are just these atoms grouped together to form the bigger composite structures that you see all around. So what is a human being according to physicalism? A biological life form made out of matter, made out of atoms at the base level. And these atoms organized and put together in that particular way generates the phenomenon that we call consciousness, the ability to see things, perceive things, have thoughts, feelings, and an internal mental life. So on the physicalist position, we're all made out of atoms, and there's nothing in this universe that's not made out of matter. Extended in space, this is a bit of a terminological turn of phrase in philosophy of mind. Extended in space just means that literally the thing takes up space, like it has parts in space. So on the physicalist view, we're all just aggregations of atoms grouped together in different ways. A table is a big bundle of atoms put together table-wise, and a human being is a big bundle of atoms put together human organism-wise. And when they form those objects, they have certain emergent properties. One of them, in the case of the human brain, is consciousness. But importantly, for the physicalist, there's nothing that's not physical. So there's no such thing as a ghost. There's no such thing as a soul or a spirit. There's no kind of disembodied consciousness that could possibly exist. So on physicalism, if the physical structure, which is the brain that generates consciousness, does not work or is destroyed, then consciousness could not exist either, because it's an entirely physical phenomenon. So if the physical requirements for consciousness don't exist, then consciousness couldn't just be somehow like floating free from the body out there in space, as though it didn't require the brain for its ultimate existence. So that's physicalism. Everything's made out of matter, including even us and our consciousness. So it kind of denies that there's a spiritual or non-physical basis for human consciousness. On the other hand, though, the other type of monism, and let me just say this, the alternative to physicalism within monism, idealism, it's not as like widespread or popular, I don't think, in the 21st century. It had a good run of popularity a few centuries back. There's some important philosophers that argued for it. George Berkeley, a Christian bishop in the 19th century, was one very powerful advocate. But anyway, idealism says that it's like the opposite extreme of physicalism. So now on this view, everything's not made out of matter. Instead, everything's made out of ideas. How weird is that? So idealism, everything in the universe is made out of ideas. So there's no such thing as matter or mass, just thoughts. Okay, now we're really only talking about idealism for this brief moment as I introduce the whole concept of monism and its two branches. Moving on from this initial explanation of it, we're pretty much going to be focused on the physicalist type of monism. But just so you understand, idealism holds that there's no matter anywhere. Like me knocking on this desk, you'd think it's a nice solid object that's made out of atoms and it's got that weight and mass that it has. On an idealist perspective, it's just an illusion that there's any such thing as material substance. There's really just thoughts all around, and everything that you see and experience is a thought, so it has no physical structure or substance. That's a kind of weird view. You might ask this question, well, if I'm not there to see it, then what happened to it? Is it like the whole philosophical sophomoric example of when there's no one in the tree to see the forest, or sorry, when there's no one in the forest to see the tree fall, does it not make a sound? Well, the most sophisticated versions of idealism out there say that when no human being is there to be the perceiver, that there's God, and God's consciousness thinks of the objects. So if there's like distant galaxies and stuff that none of us can perceive, and you wonder, well, why would they exist if no one is there, if consciousness and thought is the basis for everything? It would be God, the ultimate thinker, who maintains the apparent existence of these things by just thinking of them while he wants to do that. But anyway, like I say, just for the purposes of being formally complete, I wanted to tell you about both branches of monism, but really it's physicalism that we'll spend most time on. Now, like I started with, though, there's a whole different standpoint from monism of either kind. There's dualism. So we also need to know about this rival position to monism. Dualism says something else. So two main positions in the philosophy of mind, monism versus dualism. There's a room over here, I think so. Let me just tilt the camera just a bit. Okay, so dualism then, what's that? Now that we've understood the two types of monism, this is not so hard to understand, because dualism basically just embraces both. So dualism says that everything in the universe is made out of two different kinds of substances, and they take on both of these. So physical matter is one of the substances. The other one is mind. Let me write the definition of mind. So it's something that is not extended in space. Therefore, it has no spatial extension, no size, no weight, no shape, no mass. So something that's literally not extended in space. And is thinking. Okay, so for dualism, that's one of the substances together with physical matter. So here's the definition. Everything in the universe is made out of two kinds of substances. And those two are the ones you see listed there, matter and mind. Okay, so if you were a monist, then you would say there's only one of the two. Take your pick. If you think everything's made out of matter, then you're a physicalist. If you think everything's just made out of thoughts and there's no such thing as solid matter, then you'd be an idealist. But over here with dualism, it's like there's both. So there's matter, but there's also mind. Mind in their sense of a non-extended thinking thing. So mind in the usage of these philosophers is something closer to like a soul, okay? Like when you think about dying and going to heaven, if you ever think about that, right? You're not thinking about the body literally, somehow transmitting itself up into the heavenly realm, but rather your soul, which doesn't age, which can't take on injuries, which cannot have parts of it cut off or something, that immaterial soul will somehow reside eternally in the heavens. So this mind idea is that kind of non-physical way of thinking about your consciousness, the sort of consciousness that could endure eternally, that does not depend on the existence of the body or brain. So in a dualist worldview, there's matter, like physical objects that have mass and stuff, they're made out of matter, and so is your body, but that's not the only thing in the universe. According to dualism, there's also this mysterious, disembodied sort of soul, which they call the mind, and that's not at all a physical object. That's made out of matter, that's made out of atoms. It's not destructible in the same way that physical objects can be disassembled and cut into pieces or blown apart. So on dualism, we've got matter, but then in a human being, there's matter and mind. So we're like a nexus of the two. We have our physical bodies, but we also have this mind that somehow is in a relation to the body. Nonetheless, they're not identical to each other. On physicalism, everything's made out of matter. So when you're thinking and having conscious thoughts and everything else and mental experiences, those are just byproducts of the physical brain activity. On dualism, there's something a little bit less, there's something a little bit more, supernatural or spiritual going on. You have your thoughts and consciousness. There's some kind of connection that the mind bears to the body, like you can feel pain and stuff when the body is affected. But your mind is a separate entity which doesn't depend on the existence or survival of the body for its own existence. Okay, so now what we're going to do is try and compare and learn about the differences between the monist school of thought and the dualist school of thought. And you're going to try and hear the arguments from both sides. Like, what are the best arguments that dualism is true? And what are the best arguments that physicalism is true? So starting with this initial orientation to the topic, we'll go through a series of lectures where we're basically going to examine the arguments on either side for dualism or for physicalism. So it's really a dualism versus physicalism lecture series. And that's going to give you, I think, some of the greatest hits in the genre of the philosophy of mind for you to think about and ponder. So now I'll erase all this stuff and we'll get started on the first author here, which is yet again René Descartes, who we studied a few weeks back on epistemology. Now he wants to talk to us about his argument for dualism. So he's a dualist, and you'll try and comprehend his argument that dualism is true. Okay. So we've got here the work of René Descartes, the well-known early modern French philosopher who wrote the Meditations. Again, his life spanning from 1596 to 1650, and his book from 1641, which we read the first two chapters of previously. Now we're looking at the sixth chapter of the Meditations. So this is Meditation 6, the last chapter. Okay, and in this writing, Descartes presents his argument for dualism. Now, I'll walk you through all the details of his argument. It's a kind of complex argument with a lot of steps. So it'll take a moment for me to get through all those steps. It could swing part of the meeting into Wednesday, but if needed, we'll do that. But first of all, the overview, the general overview of it, is that he argues that the mind and the body are two separate things because we can clearly imagine the mind existing without the body and vice versa. So it's really an argument based on the conceivability of the mind and the body existing separately. Since that's clearly something that we can imagine, he thinks that it must be true. So the clear thought in the mind of you being able to somehow like continue to think and experience and judge even if your body didn't exist or no longer existed. He says because we can clearly imagine the continuation of consciousness even without a body, it must be true that the two things are not the same and that they are separate and distinct. But that's like a big, very, very simplified overview. And what we need to do is really get into the clear details that he wrote down. Now, some of the things that I'm going to reveal to you in this sixth meditation have to do with some arguments and comments that he made in the intervening chapters between chapter 2 and chapter 6, so 3, 4, and 5. And I think I have to kind of summarize a couple of those points in order for his argument to be as clear as possible to you, since what they gave us in our own textbook omits some of the details, and therefore, without knowing them, you might miss some of the context. So I'm going to walk you through his argument step by step. So here we go, Descartes' argument for dualism, which, again, we find major parts of in Meditation 6. So this is Descartes' best shot at trying to prove to everybody that there's two different substances that make everything up, and it's not just matter, but there's also mind. Okay, so to start off, he says this. He refers to what we've learned through his so-called method of doubt. And he says, based on the method of doubt, I'm able to doubt everything that I perceived with my five senses, and even such things as math and logic. So he says, because of the method of doubt, which says to assume that things are false, if there's any possible way they could be false, that raises doubts about many things, including everything that your five senses ever take in, because you could be dreaming, and even things about math, logic, so forth, because there could be like an external deceiver, like an evil demon. So the first premise will just be to remind us of how far-reaching the method of doubt extends. Based on the method of doubt, so this is the first premise. Sorry, I'm just listing this as a number one, like premise one, the first step in the argument. Okay, so based on the method of doubt, I'm able to doubt everything perceived by the senses and even beyond that, and even math and logic, for the different reasons mentioned before. Okay, so what does that leave us with? Well, if we can doubt everything perceived by the senses, even math and logic, is there anything that's still certain, despite the method of doubt? And we learned that there actually is. Who thinks they remember that? The one and only thing that Descartes says is still totally certain, even if you're using the method of doubt. What did he say on this? He said that you know for a fact that something exists. What would that be? Yeah, let me know. If we just go back in the memory or notes or a combination of both, you may have some knowledge here about what Descartes said. So yeah, that's right, Ellie, your consciousness. Nicole, you say yourself, but it is, I think, most precise to say your consciousness because, yes, it is yourself, but he says the part of yourself that's the thinking part. You don't know necessarily of the existence of the body because the body is something that's perceived through the five senses, and so who knows, maybe even that physical body and appearance that you think you have is a false illusion. But if nothing else, you're the thinker, so you must have a mind thinking if at a minimum. So that's the thing that he says remains totally certain despite this method, and I can add that to the argument. So starting with 1. Based on the method of doubt, I'm able to doubt everything perceived by the senses, even math and logic. But despite this, I know that I exist, at least as a non-physical mind, because I'm thinking, okay? Okay, so the opening couple of moves here in the argument. The first one just reminds us of how much is subject to doubt based on the method. Almost everything. Everything you can perceive, everything you can intuit, even mathematically and logically. But nonetheless, there's this one thing that cannot be doubted by any individual, and that is their own consciousness exists, even if we don't know for a fact that the remaining body exists. At a minimum, you know that you exist as a mind because of the very fact that you can think. So what follows next? He says, next, since you know you're a mind thinking at a minimum, what's the thoughts that you have? There are many different thoughts, but he calls out one for special mention. He says, as a mind, I know I have thoughts, and one of my thoughts is unique because it is the idea of God. Okay? In my mind, there are thoughts. Including the idea of God. Okay, so he thinks that no one's going to be able to object so far. I mean, all he said so far is a lot of stuff is at least theoretically capable of being doubted, except for the fact that you're thinking, which is, of course, impossible to doubt as long as you're thinking at all. So regarding your thoughts that you have, that says there, it says, in my mind, there are thoughts. I can see there's a glare, but the word that's kind of occluded is there are thoughts. So anyway, since I know I'm a mind that's thinking, if nothing else, let's go into my mind. I'm thinking thoughts, and I have a lot of thoughts, but one of them he says let's focus on is the thought of God. Why? Why does he want us to consider this one especially? Well, because he says this thought or idea is unique, because unlike every other idea in your mind, the idea of God is the idea of something infinite. It's the idea of an infinite being. So he thinks that this is the only kind of idea like that. The idea of everything else is the idea of something finite with limits. So like if I'm thinking about Chapman University, I'm thinking about a place that's existed, 150 years maybe, and it can't last forever. I mean, obviously even the planet Earth can be consumed in the supernova of the sun at some future date. So these are things that are temporary, basically. But when you think of God, you think of something that has no limitations, is infinite, unlimited, eternal. So anyway, summarizing that thought is this premise. In my mind, there are thoughts including the idea of God. The idea of God is special because it's the idea of an infinite being. The idea of God is special, unique. I'll say unique, but it's sort of the same thing. And why? Because it is the idea of an infinite being. Unlike the idea of anything else, it's the idea of something infinite. Okay. So he's going to take the argument into the next step after this, but so far what he's gotten to establish is just that much can be doubted, but you can't doubt that you exist because you're thinking. And in that head, you've got thoughts. One of them is the idea of God, which is really special because it stands alone as the idea of an infinite being. Now, based on this idea of God being infinite, that's a big point of leverage for him because he says, since the idea of God is the idea of an infinite being, it has to come from some source that has at least that much reality. Okay, so since my idea of God is infinite, it must be caused by something which is infinite. Okay, so that's his next premise. Since the idea of God is infinite, it must come from a source which has infinite reality. Okay, so let me try and explain this little point. This is one of the perhaps tricky points in the argument, but I think there's one easy way to understand it. See, back when I was at college in UCLA a long time ago, I was learning the same material, and I had a professor give me a pretty, I thought, clear and helpful example to illustrate this point. So here's the idea. Let me try and make this little thing intuitive to you. So suppose we have these two containers, guys. So this is just container A, and here is container B. Okay, so A and B. Now, I want you to understand that in container B, there's 1 gallon of water. Okay, there's a gallon in B. That's what it's holding. And it got it from A. So like A deposited the contents that B now holds. So this should be very, I think, simple mathematically. If that's true, if A gave this content to B, then A has to have how much at minimum storage capacity? So A, for it to be the depositor of a gallon into B, A must have greater than or equal to how much storage capacity? That's the question. If A gave a gallon to B, then you know already that A must be able to hold minimum how much? A gallon, right? Of course, Ellie, because if A was like a half gallon, then this would be illogical. It's not possible for something that holds less than a gallon to deposit a gallon. So given that B holds a gallon and it got it from A, we can deduce that A is of a gallon size or more. Okay, so it couldn't be smaller, basically, than the thing which it's giving to B. Now, along the same lines as a sort of metaphor or analogy, suppose that your container B, your mind, and into this mind drops an idea of God. And how much reality does this idea of God have? Like the idea of God, he says, is a what kind of idea? An infinite idea. So here's the infinity symbol, like a sideways turned figure 8. So this idea has to come from something. The idea that you have of God, which I'm representing with the infinity symbol, it's coming from some source. Question: if it comes from a source outside of you, then how much reality does the idea causer have to give you that idea of something infinite? So, if you've been given an infinite idea from something, then whatever gives you the idea has to have at least how much reality to it. Can you formulate the answer to that question? It's along the same lines of the previous example where it was just water containers. But if B is the container of your mind holding an idea of God which is infinite, then he thinks that has to be coming down from a source that has how much reality at least? Question then, so let me know. You see those question marks? That's a question to you. How much reality does that source have to have if it has imparted to us an idea of God, which is infinite? There you go. Correct, Ellie. It also has to be infinite. Why? Because of the exact same reason. Because it's not possible for something that has finite reality to depart to us an idea of something infinite. That would be like a container with half a gallon capacity pouring out a gallon into something else. So he's working backwards from the knowledge that you do have an idea of God in your mind, and it is infinite. He says if it's infinite, then it has to come from something that is at least infinite. And what does that mean? That means that there actually is a God, because it's only God that could possibly serve as that cause, because everything else in the universe is finite and has limits and is temporary. So he says, wow, I've proven God exists. So that's kind of his spin on the ontological argument. It's not exactly the ontological argument, but it's kind of similar because he says the idea of God is just too great to come from something that's not God. So there really is God then. Okay, so that's the next step of the argument, using this little insight that I was trying to explain to you. Since the idea of God is infinite, it must come from a source which has infinite reality. So then, sixth premise, just continuing the ledger over here, number 6. So therefore, God exists. Okay, now that's another key step along the way in his argument, because he thinks that proving God's existence unlocks a whole bunch of other things. Once he thinks that God's existence has now been demonstrated, he adds to the argument the following claim. Since God exists, and since God is omnibenevolent, perfectly good, infinitely good, that means that he would not want to deceive us when we have got clear and distinct perceptions. So, since God is perfectly good, since God exists and is perfectly good, infinitely good, omnibenevolent, he would not deceive us. He's not a deceiver, so he would not deceive us when we have clear and distinct perceptions. So the seventh premise, it says that since God exists, according to the preceding steps of the argument, since God exists and he's known to be perfectly good, omnibenevolent, he would therefore not deceive us when we have clear and distinct perceptions. Okay, so what the argument is claiming is this. Since there has to be some kind of cause of our idea of God, and it has to be God himself, we can further conclude that God, being perfectly benevolent, is not a deceiver. And since he's not a deceiver, that means that when we have clear and distinct perceptions, they're guaranteed to be true. For example, if right now I was just dreaming having this lecture with you guys, and I'm really it's all fake, and this is a big hologram or simulation or something, if that was true, then God would really be messing with me. And it would be messed up, right? I would be sitting here thinking, I'm a professor, I'm teaching a class, when who knows what's really going on. I'm like, in the Matrix, being fed all this information into like a computer program that I'm a part of. If that was the case, then God would really be sitting back watching me live through a whole illusion, and that would be very deceptive. And Descartes argues that would be contrary to the perfect goodness of the omnibenevolent God. So we can thus take comfort and confidence in the certainty that when we have clear and distinct perceptions, they're bound to be true. They're bound to be true because God doesn't want, being as good as he is, for you to get everything wrong, even when it's so obvious and clear. So that means that we can now actually trust our clear and distinct perceptions. He uses that as a kind of term of art. Clear and distinct perceptions are just judgments that come to you naturally, that you're bound to make, and that it would be really manipulative of God if he was going to make those things false. So anyway, long story short, where we've gotten to in the argument is that you can trust in the clear and distinct things. Why? Because God is not going to trick you about those things because he's too good. And how do we know he exists? Because we have an idea of him which is too infinite to come from something that isn't God. And how do we know we have those ideas? Because you're a thing that exists because you're thinking, even though there's a method of doubt. Okay, so there's only a couple steps left in the argument. I will have to finish those last few steps off in the beginning on Wednesday, but as a preview, here's what he will say after this. He says, well, since my clear and distinct perceptions have to be true, because God guarantees that they will be true since he's so good, let's ask which clear and distinct perceptions that I have. And he says, one of my clear and distinct perceptions is that if you can clearly conceive of two things existing separately, then those are two separate things. So the principle is that if you can clearly imagine two things existing apart from each other, then they must actually be two different objects or entities. And from there's only the last step. We can clearly imagine the mind and the body existing separately. Since we can clearly imagine that, God would not want to trick us about it, so they are two separate things. And thus the mind and the body are not one, but are somehow distinct things interacting together to form the body and mind that you have. But you're most essentially the mind, because the mind can persist and endure even after the physical death of the body and the destruction of the body. So it's all about conceivability. Conceivability is guaranteed to be true and accurate because of the guarantee provided by the perfectly good God. And so it's really only he thinks that if we believed in God or that we could assure ourselves that God existed, that we would get the certainty that we're looking for. Otherwise, everything would remain subject to doubt. But anyway, the argument for dualism proceeds from the ability to clearly conceive of the mind and body existing separately. And since we can clearly imagine it, God guarantees that they're separate things. But let's continue on the beginning of Wednesday. We have a couple remaining steps in this big detailed argument from Descartes for dualism. But it's an interesting argument. It's certainly captivated minds for centuries, and we still think a lot about it. So we'll continue with this, and then we'll talk about physicalism also on Wednesday. So read the article by Daniel Stoljar for Wednesday, and we'll roll right into him as soon as I'm done with the last few minutes of the Descartes. Okay, guys, so I'm gonna let you go. I don't want to hold you too late. Everything's good. Let me know in the chat if so, and then I'll close the stream for now. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Nina, and all the rest. Hope you guys had a nice, solid weekend and got some good sleep. Take it easy then, and I'll be back with you on Wednesday. Okay, bye-bye, guys. Thanks again.